That morning, the sky over Riverbrook was a still blue, as if no one had ever cried on this earth. The clouds drifted idly, the birds flew overhead without warning of anything, and train number 347 quietly stopped at the small station, just like so many times before. But this time, someone stepped off, carrying an entire world waiting to be proven. Layla Bennett stood there, wearing a deep blue dress, perfectly pressed, spotless, white gloves and a small silk hat that covered half of her face. The 25-year-old woman, with the appearance of a lady straight out of a classic novel, had just completed a 3-week journey across the state. In her old leather trunk were her finest dresses, a few of her favorite books, and the letters she had preserved with all her heart. Ahead of her was Gregory Walsh, the man who had written her tender words over the past 6 months. A widower, lonely, and always saying he only needed someone who would listen. She had believed that even in a society still full of prejudice, handwritten affection, born of genuine loneliness, could transcend all the walls of skin color. But she had been wrong. Gregory stood there, holding a bouquet of carnations that had already begun to wilt. When their eyes met in just a split second, she saw everything clearly: the surprise, the embarrassment, and then the rejection. His gaze sliced through the fabric of courtesy like a blade cutting straight into where she had once placed her trust. "You're Layla Bennett?" he asked, swallowing hard, stepping back as if he had just encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist. Layla smiled softly, a smile of endurance, of pride, and replied for the words he didn't dare to say out loud. "Yes. And yes, I am the woman in those letters. Only my skin color wasn't attached at the end of each page." A chilling silence followed. She could hear the sound of luggage wheels rolling across the stone floor. Passers-by paused to look, curious eyes, whispering voices. A black woman is being publicly rejected by a white man in the middle of a southern town's train station. Gregory lowered his head, stammering, I didn't think. In your letters you wrote so beautifully. I imagined. You imagined a different skin color, Layla replied firmly, but not harshly. You could imagine everything except one simple truth, that my feelings are just as real as yours. He hesitated, glanced around, then lowered his voice. You have to understand, around here, this community, my job, I can't. Gregory awkwardly pulled out his wallet and held out a few crumpled bills. Here, enough for a few days. I figured you'd know how to manage. Layla looked at him, her eyes no longer watery as they had been when she stepped off the train, but now lit up with something more profound. Not tears, but a fire, smoldering, silent and growing. A few days, Layla repeated the phrase as she looked at the crumpled bills. It wasn't the small amount that hurt. It was the fact that he believed a person's worth could be measured by what was left in a wallet. She said nothing and didn't take the money. She tightened her grip on the trunk and turned to walk away. But just then, as if the universe had decided that today's humiliation needed a witness, a deep voice, steady as a grandfather clock, echoed from behind. That's how you solve everything. Mr. Walsh, throw money at the problem and expect it to vanish like always. Every eye on the platform turned at once. Gregory startled and spun around, his face pale. Layla turned as well and stood still. The man stepped out from the shadow of the sunlight. Tall, solid sleeves, rolled up dark khaki trousers, and well-polished old boots. Nothing flashy about him, but the way he stood, shoulders square, eyes steady, and a voice that didn't need to shout to silence a room, exuded an undeniable kind of authority. Ethan, Gregory swallowed dryly. This has nothing to do with you. It does, Ethan, Caldwell replied, unblinking. I can't stay silent watching a man I've known for 15 years act like a coward. He turned to Layla, his voice softening halfway but still resonant like a command. Miss, I'm Ethan Caldwell. I have a farm 10 miles from here and a house with more rooms than I know what to do with. If you need shelter for a few days, or a few weeks, I offer it freely. My home always has hot tea, a fireplace, and the respect that every person deserves. Layla stood frozen, not because of the offer, but because of his eyes. No pity, no sorrow, only recognition, as if he had seen something the world had chosen to overlook in her. Gregory cut in quickly. Are you insane, Ethan? What will the town say, a single man taking a black woman to live with him? Ethan smiled a cold smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. They'll talk, and then show up at my door Monday morning, asking for fertilizer extensions or grazing rights for their cattle on my land. The platform fell silent. Gregory's face turned pale. One by one, from the station staff to homemakers carrying baskets, they all stepped back. Because now it wasn't just about a rejected woman. It was about a man willing to stand beside her in front of everyone. Layla looked at Ethan, her lips parted as if to say something, but she stopped. She gave a slight nod. Then, I'll accept. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan, he corrected. No one needs titles here. We'll talk in the carriage. And I don't carry anyone's past, only their future. Ethan took her hand and gently pulled her trunk. Gregory stood frozen, the wilted bouquet falling to the ground, and no one bent to pick it up. The road from the station to Caldwell Farm stretched between fields of harvested corn. Layla sat in the horse-drawn carriage beside Ethan, the quiet man, like a breeze across the fields, whose eyes were always set forward as if he knew exactly where he was going. They didn't say much, only the rhythmic clatter of hooves, and occasionally the sound of dry leaves crushed beneath the wheels. Layla didn't ask why he helped her. He didn't ask why she didn't go back. Perhaps they both understood that there are things more important than explanations. There is action. When the large iron gate closed behind them, Layla looked up, and for the first time she truly paused. The farm Ethan spoke of was an old Victorian mansion, 3 stories tall, draped in vines with gardens more expansive than the public park she used to visit. Far in the distance, herds of horses grazed on endless pastures. The air here wasn't just peaceful, it was soaked in old history, as if each stone in the walkway held a memory. Don't let appearances fool you, Ethan said as he helped her from the carriage. It's big, but often very empty. The wooden door opened. A middle-aged woman, her posture firm but her eyes gentle, stepped forward to greet them. This is Miss Hughes. Ethan introduced. She keeps everything here running on time, and she's the only one who can get me to eat vegetables. Miss Hughes nodded. I've prepared the blue room, upstairs, overlooking the lavender garden. You'll like it. Not a curious glance, not a whisper. Layla realized that politeness here wasn't mere courtesy, but a deliberate choice. That evening, in the graceful room with lace curtains and a walnut desk, Layla opened her trunk. She took out her dresses, a few books, and a small photo frame of her mother. Then, she lifted the cloth at the bottom of the trunk. Underneath was an old leather folder carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were antique land maps, land ownership certificates, and a parchment-colored document bearing the governor's signature referencing a name almost no one remembered anymore, Joseph Freeman. Her great-grandfather, a man who had once been enslaved, freed after the Civil War, and granted legal land ownership in this region. But not long after, he had been forced off it through violence and threats. Layla's grandmother still told that story on winter nights, her voice trembling softly like early summer winds. We didn't leave. We were erased, Layla ran her fingers across the faded ink. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: she hadn't carried this secret across 1,000 miles to bury it again. That night, sitting alone in the grand library of the estate, surrounded by hundreds of old bookshelves reaching the ceiling and a pale yellow oil lamp, Layla didn't read novels as she usually did. Instead, she pulled out the local atlas, a book on the history of Riverbrook and the land records. Line by line, fragment by fragment, name by name. It was as if the entire town had tried to hide a painting, but she, the woman who had been rejected the moment she stepped off the train, was now retracing every mark to redraw that painting. With the truth. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window of the blue room, lighting up the edge of the still open leather trunk. Layla stood before the mirror, smoothing the hem of her dress. She wore a light brown dress that Miss Hughes had skillfully tailored, refined and sturdy enough. An outfit not meant to impress, but to declare, "I belong here." At breakfast, Ethan sat across from her, placed his teacup down and said casually, "I'd like to offer you the responsibility of managing the estate library." Layla paused. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't think I've Ethan," he interrupted. "And I don't think you've seen the mess in there, over 100 years of books, records, and documents, but no one's ever truly known what we've been keeping." He looked at her with unwavering eyes. "I believe you will." 3 days later, Layla began her work not as a guest, but as the first woman ever entrusted to touch the Caldwell family's history. She didn't just shelve books. She created a coded cataloging system, sorted records, and excavated drawers filled with dusty parchment. She found old minutes, hand-drawn maps, correspondence between generations of landowners, and documents even Ethan had never read carefully. And then, the whispers began. "Is it true Mr. Caldwell has a colored schoolteacher living in his home? She came from Boston, wrote letters to Gregory Walsh, and got rejected. Caldwell's library is now a secret base for Northerners, shopkeepers, the pastor's wife, and even the mayor started dropping by the estate one by one. They claimed to visit Ethan, bringing apple pies or documents to verify, but their eyes always drifted over Layla as if she were some strange novel needing dissection. That afternoon, after escorting out the fourth group of social visitors, Ethan sat in the leather chair in the library, sipped his tea, and said, half joking, half serious, "You know, in just a week, you've become the hottest topic in Riverbrook, and you haven't even stepped outside the gates." Layla looked up from a stack of files and smiled. "You know why they come, don't you? Because they've never seen a black woman sitting in a room paneled in oak, holding the keys to their history." She paused, then added without bitterness, "I've always been the center of attention, Mr. Caldwell. The only difference is that I'm holding a porcelain teacup instead of a serving tray, and they don't know what to do with that." Ethan chuckled, but Layla didn't. That evening, she closed the library early. In the warm yellow glow of the oil lamp, she opened a file marked with an old label, Riverbrook Land Ownership, 1870 to 1872. The first page, blank. The second, torn. She frowned. Stranger still, records from 1860 to 1890 were intact, except for that period exactly 2 years after Joseph Freeman, her great-grandfather, was forced out of the land under mysterious circumstances. She flipped the ledger over. On the back, a faint pencil note began to appear, reference letter from General Collins. File under Western Agricultural Zoning. Layla held her breath. History had once been hidden beneath thousands of sheets, but not erased. And she, the woman rejected at the train station, now held the thread that could unravel the system they once thought unshakable. That night, Layla didn't sleep. She sat at the cherry wood desk under the warm glow of the oil lamp, surrounded by dozens of ancient documents. Papers thin as skin ink, faded and written with steel nib pens, revealed familiar names: Caldwell, Walsh, Harper, Miller, all listed as members of the Agricultural Resource Allocation Committee of 1871. According to public records, that committee was formed to protect land from abandonment after the war. But what Layla uncovered in unofficial minutes suggested something else. It was the very group that divided up land that once belonged to Joseph Freeman. Her ancestor, a man whom the state had legally granted land ownership, then driven out of town after an unidentified incident. And those who drove him out, their descendants now held the banks, the churches, the offices, and the truth. Layla sat there, her fingers lightly touching an old hand-drawn map outlined in red, marking the plot of land covering nearly 60% of present-day Riverbrook. In the corner, the faded handwriting read, "Freeman Allotment, ratified 1866. The next morning, when Ethan entered the library with his usual cup of coffee, he found Layla still wearing the same blouse from the night before, dark circles under her eyes, but a diagram linking names, dates, and illegal land transfers was spread across the table. "What are you doing?" he asked, half curious, half concerned. Layla looked at him, her gaze no longer that of a guest or someone wounded. It was the look of a person holding a truth everyone else was afraid to face. "You once asked why I came to Riverbrook," she said softly. "It wasn't just because I wanted a fresh start. It was because I knew what belonged to my great-grandfather wasn't lost, it was hidden. And now I've found it." She pulled the map to the center of the table. Ethan leaned down silently. His eyes moved across the notes, dates, deeds, and diagrams, and finally stopped at the name Joseph Freeman. He looked up. "Are you sure?" Layla nodded. "As sure as the look Gregory Walsh gave me at the train station. The way he looked at me is exactly how his ancestor must have looked at mine." That wasn't a surprise. It was recognition of something he thought had been buried. Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed. "If what you found is true, it could shake this entire town." "Not if, Mr. Caldwell," she corrected. "I didn't come here to shake anything. I came to rebuild a truth that was twisted at its very foundation." From that day on, Layla stepped into a new rhythm that was outwardly quiet, but inwardly full of tense preparation. By day, she continued her librarian duties, repairing books, sorting documents, and offering gentle smiles to visiting guests. But by night, she cross-referenced records, drew maps, marked the names of those who had once been commissioners, traced the inheritance of lands, and reconstructed the missing pieces from scattered sources: personal journals, stray letters, debt ledgers. She recorded everything in a small notebook she always kept with her, a copy of all the evidence in case anything accidentally disappeared. Miss Hughes, the once cold housekeeper, began to look at Layla differently. One time, upon seeing Layla quietly locking documents into the small safe in the library, she merely said, "Women like you weren't born to wait for justice to be handed to them. You take it, and then divide it. Fairly." Layla smiled, said nothing, but that line she would remember forever. In another corner of town, Gregory Walsh began to hear rumors that the black woman he had once humiliated was now entrusted by Ethan Caldwell to oversee the entire library and receive guests as though she were the lady of the house. There were documents within that library forcing the oldest names in Riverbrook to revisit their roots. Gregory was shaken, and for the first time in his life, he felt real fear. 2 weeks after Layla had walked through the gates of the Caldwell estate, Gregory Walsh appeared again, this time not at the train station, but at the front door of the most powerful house in town. No one had invited him, no one expected his return, but Gregory came because he was afraid. not of the woman herself, but of what she might unleash. Mr. Walsh arrived unannounced, Miss Hughes said, as she entered the library. Layla nodded. She put down her pen. The diary page she had been writing bore a single line. When the one who uprooted the seed returns, it's because it has already begun to sprout elsewhere. Gregory entered, clutching his hat in both hands, his face caught between courtesy and anxiety. But what he saw made him hesitate. Layla was seated behind the large oak desk. Besides her were neatly sorted stacks of documents. She was dressed in a deep wine-colored dress, her hair pinned high, and a gaze sharp as a blade slicing through any pretense. "Miss Bennett," he spoke first, his voice forced steady. I came to check if you're doing all right." "More than all right," she replied without looking up. "And you, how does it feel to see a woman not as you imagined? Sitting in a place you believed she didn't belong." Gregory gave an awkward chuckle. "I suppose there was an unfortunate misunderstanding between us. I was only concerned for reputations. You understand, a single woman living in a single man's house, it's bound to become the topic of those who have nothing else to discuss," she cut in coldly. "So tell me, Mr. Walsh, are you worried for the town or your seat on the land allocation board?" He flinched. "What exactly are you reading in that library?" Layla stood up. Her posture was tall, straight, and unwavering, unlike the woman who had once been left standing at a train platform. "I'm reading history, Mr. Walsh. Not the kind taught in classrooms, but the kind hidden in safes, in basements, and in meetings where black women were never invited." Gregory forced a smile. "You're getting caught up in things that aren't real. Old documents like those don't prove anything." Layla slowly opened a drawer, pulled out a document, and laid it on the desk. "This is a 1871 land zoning map signed by your father, Elijah Walsh, as a commissioner of the Agricultural Land Reconstruction Committee. And in the bottom right corner, do you see it says transferred from Freeman Western Lot 114 acres. Approved by council, no ownership verification required." Gregory's face turned pale. "What do you intend to do?" Layla met his eyes, not with anger, not with fear, only with the steadiness of someone who had long been prepared. "I didn't come to reclaim every acre," she said. "I came to reclaim the truth. And if that truth frightens you, then it most certainly deserves to come to light." Gregory clutched his hat and stood up. His voice trembled slightly. "You'll destroy everything." Layla shook her head. "No, Mr. Walsh. What you and the other families did, that's what destroyed things. I'm just peeling each brick back to see the foundation." He turned to leave, staggering, dazed, as if struck in the gut. When the door closed behind him, Layla sat back down, opened her notebook, and added a new line. "When the one who once rejected you begins to tremble at your silence, that is when justice begins to speak." Rumors spread like wildfire. The black woman at Caldwell's is about to sue the whole town. She's got old papers, but who's to say they're real? The council is being pressured into holding a public hearing, and then the thing no one believed could happen did. Every seat was filled one Thursday afternoon at the Riverbrook Town Hall. People who had never stepped into the chamber before were present, from the liquor store owner, the barber, the former town librarian, to curious high school students peeking from the doorway. At the front sat Gregory Walsh, his face flushed, red eyes darting nervously at his notes, alongside representatives of the town's founding families. They sat as if long accustomed to being above others, with expressions meant more for judgment than listening. But today all eyes turned toward the large doors slowly opening. Layla Bennett entered, walking tall, her head held high, and a black leather briefcase in her hand. Behind her was Ethan Caldwell, moving slowly but firmly, like a man who didn't need many words. because his presence said enough. A whisper rippled from the back row. She didn't come as a guest. She came as a witness. The session moderator, Judge Raymond Thornton, rose solemnly. We've been informed that Miss Bennett has documents to present about historic land ownership in Riverbrook. Are you prepared to speak? Layla nodded. Not a trace of hesitation. She opened the case and took out a thick set of documents, each page marked and organized. She placed a copy in front of each council member. Then she spoke, her voice clear, not loud, but with a presence no one dared interrupt. I didn't come here to accuse. I came to remind that Riverbrook wasn't built only on stone and sweat, but also on willful forgetting. She held up a document. This is a legal land grant signed by the governor in 1866, awarded to my great-grandfather, Joseph Freeman, a black man freed after the Civil War. And here are zoning maps from the Caldwell Library showing that most of the town centre today, including Mr. Walsh's store, the old church and the council district, all sit on land that once belonged to him. A wave of murmurs swept across the room. Layla continued, without pause, without blinking. The documents I present today are not just evidence. They are the pieces of history that were removed. A history that you or your ancestors helped distort by calling it administrative process. Gregory jumped to his feet. Objection. This is fabricated. No council ever approved such a thing. Joseph Freeman is just a name woven into legend. Layla smiled for the first time since she had entered. Not a soft smile, but one that knew exactly which card she held. If Joseph Freeman were merely a myth, then I'm sorry for you, Mr. Walsh, because the deed to your store bears the line Transferred Asset Authorization by Riverbrook Council, August 1871. And in the Caldwell Library's archive, that entry is followed by This land formerly belonged to Freeman, no further trace required. The entire hall fell silent, like the air had been vacuumed. Judge Thornton stepped forward, picked up the folder and turned through its pages. His eyes stopped at a parchment-yellow document sealed with the undeniable and exact emblem of the state of Georgia. He looked up. These documents require independent verification, but I must admit they appear far more credible than what we've been taught. In the third row, Reverend Samuel Miller, his hair snowy white, bowed his head in silence. My father once whispered that this town was built on a sin no one dared name. Now I understand what it was. Gregory slumped into his seat. He turned to Layla, voice hoarse. What do you want to destroy us? Layla quietly gathered the documents, then looked at him one last time, not with anger or pity, only with the clarity of someone who would no longer tolerate silence. No, I want to correct what was never written right. And if someone has to lose something in that process, remember, they never truly had it legally to begin with. The air in the hall remained heavy with the weight of her words. No one spoke, no one left. Even Gregory Walsh, who once stood atop every town vote, now slumped, his hands trembling faintly on his knees. Judge Thornton cleared his throat, though even he struggled to maintain his usual composure. Miss Bennett, with the evidence you've presented, if you were to file a civil suit, you could reclaim most of Riverbrook's central lands. Are you planning to go that route? Layla stood in the center of the room. Each step she took toward the podium echoed through the old oak-paneled hall like a knock on the door of a new era. She placed her hand on the lectern not as an accuser, but as someone beginning a new chapter. I could claim everything, and there would be lawyers willing to help. There would be media court rulings and people losing far more than their reputations. But I didn't come here to take back land. By taking more away. She looked around, her eyes moving across every face now silent. Some confused, some like Reverend Miller were already in tears. But all are listening. I came here to do what my ancestors were never allowed to return what is right to the right people in the right way. She pulled out a second folder. Ethan stood behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder to quietly support her. I proposed the creation of the Freeman Foundation, named after my great-grandfather Joseph Freeman, to use the disputed land for community good schools, affordable housing, scholarships for the poor, and public services for families who never had a fair chance. I don't want anyone to lose their home, but I want everyone to have one. I don't want anyone to lose their name, but I want everyone to know the truth. She turned to Gregory, the man who once rejected her, with a glance at the train station. Even you, Mr. Walsh, will not be evicted from your store. But instead of absolute ownership, you will sign a commercial lease with 40% of your voluntary profits directed to the community fund. No one's forcing you, but if you refuse, you'll answer to the law and the public. A new wave of murmuring rose, but this time it was no longer the hum of scorn. It was the sound of realization that they had just been given a chance to make things right and be forgiven. Judge Thornton looked at Layla for a long moment, then he nodded slowly but firmly. We will form a special committee to oversee this proposal, and I will be the first to sign. From the back of the room, Mrs. Martha Webb, the newly appointed principal of the town school, rose to her feet. I offer my ancestral home to become Riverbrook's first public library. Enough. It's time we start learning again from the beginning. A round of applause began slowly at first, but then it grew not for a victory, but for the different path Layla had chosen. No one could have predicted that the woman once abandoned at the train station, denied not by words but by prejudice, would be the person to lay the first stone for a new Riverbrook. Gregory whispered almost to himself, "You could have eradicated us." Layla didn't answer. She looked at him not with anger or pity, but with the unshakable resolve of someone who no longer belonged to the old world. I didn't come to destroy. I came to rebuild. But this time, I won't be asked for permission. 6 months after that historic town meeting, Riverbrook was no longer the same town where Layla had first stepped off the train. A small bronze plaque stood in the town square, not a grand monument, but a modest marker engraved with a simple message. This land once belonged to Joseph Freeman, a man stripped of his right to live on what was his. Today, the present people choose to return not just the land, but the truth. Below were the signatures of those who had once opposed Layla, but now voluntarily serve alongside her on the Freeman Foundation Council. The old building that used to be Walsh's store, a symbol of rejection, was now the Freeman Walsh Public Library, where black children, white children, the farmer's kid, and the landowner's kid sat side by side reading. And the Caldwell estate, its gates were now wide open, and part of it had been transformed into a community center, hosting free classes, legal workshops, and public forums on historical justice. Layla never stood on a stage. She sat at the library desk helping children learn how to search for books. But everyone knew those doors were open because of her. News of the South's first non-violent land redistribution spread across the state. Universities invited Layla to speak, and human rights groups sought to learn from her model. She didn't accept every invitation. But wherever she went, she only said one thing: justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins where people dare to face themselves and still choose forgiveness. One autumn afternoon, as leaves blanketed the front lawn of the Caldwell estate, Ethan stepped into the garden holding 2 cups of cinnamon tea. Layla sat on a stone bench, watching the children playing under trees, that had once been off-limits to anyone who didn't serve the house. He handed her a cup. They sat in silence. Then she spoke softly, but full of reflection. "Isn't it strange? Gregory rejected me because he couldn't imagine sharing a life with someone like me. And yet, that's precisely what cost him everything." Ethan looked at her eyes gleaming with a bittersweet smile. "I lived differently from him. I was never afraid of your difference. I loved the very things he feared: your intellect, memory, honesty, and the way you never compromise on what matters." Layla tilted her head gently. "The one thing I never lost was the ability to believe in goodness even when it came late." Inside the community center, Principal Martha Webb guided students in writing a school mural about the woman who changed Riverbrook. A small girl raised her hand. "Is she a hero?" Mrs. Webb smiled. "No. She didn't come to be a hero. She came to reclaim the place her ancestors were stripped of. But because she chose to rebuild instead of retaliate, she became someone every future generation must remember." That night the skies over Riverbrook were still. Layla sat on the porch, a soft wool shawl draped over her shoulders, eyes resting on the town square where golden light bathed the bronze plaque bearing Joseph Freeman's name. No visitors tonight, no cameras, no speeches, no interviews. And in that silence, she felt more whole than ever. Ethan stepped out, holding 2 cups of chamomile tea. He placed one beside her and sat down. He said nothing, just looked out at the sleeping town beside her, a town that once turned its back on someone like her, but now bowed its head and began learning the word justice. Layla spoke, her voice as light as falling leaves. "I used to think revenge would feel like justice. Making them pay as my great-grandfather once did would be the only way to balance history." She paused, breathing in the scent of cinnamon tea and damp earth after an evening rain. "But then I realized, if I return their cruelty with the same bitterness they once used, then the only difference between us is who holds the power now." Ethan looked at her, his gaze as steady as an unspoken nod. "Now I understand. True justice isn't about reclaiming everything we lost. It's about building a place where no one else has to lose just because they look like us." In the distance, children's laughter echoed from the library, where a few families lingered, playing board games and reading. Layla smiled, not because things were perfect, but because people were trying, with their hearts. She pulled out a small notebook, the journal she had started the day she first stepped off the train in Riverbrook. She flipped to the last page. In the moonlight, she wrote, "Justice doesn't begin with a declaration. It begins when someone dares to stand, someone dares to listen, and a whole community dares to change. I, Layla Bennett, didn't come to tear down. I came to rebuild, not just a town, but the belief that justice can still be delivered through compassion." In the center square, the bronze plaque shimmered beneath the silver moon. No statues, no portraits. Just one quiet name, Joseph Freeman, and beneath it the inscription, "So the stories buried in silence won't stay forgotten. And so their children, though once denied, can return and be called builders." Layla looked at Ethan. He gently squeezed her hand. No words were needed, because they both knew. This story didn't end here. It would continue through every book on the library shelf, every home built by the Freeman Foundation, every child raised to know worth isn't your skin color, but how you rise and let others rise with you. A journey that began in rejection ended in recognition, not because of power, but because Layla Bennett chose the most challenging path: to forgive without forgetting, to fight without destroying, to build on the very ground that once fell apart.